But I like to begin all of my intro Phil classes by sharing some very good news with my students. Some good news that most of them are not aware of before signing up for this course. And the good news is this: you can get infinite free chocolate. Anybody know this already? You can get infinite free chocolate. This is how you get infinite free chocolate. That's all there is to it. Oops. So, infinite free chocolate. We can all now just forget about our plans to, get degrees and get jobs and pay bills with our jobs, because we can just generate infinite free chocolate for the rest of our lives and sell it, right? Does that sound like a plan? What might be a problem with that? Can we get infinite free chocolate? No, we cannot get infinite free chocolate, unfortunately. Let me reverse this a few frames. I hate to ruin the excitement I may have generated 2 minutes ago by saying you could, but yeah, we just can't. We can't get infinite free chocolate. Why do we know that we can't get infinite free chocolate? I mean, there's a number of ways we could go about concluding that we cannot get infinite free chocolate. Dealing only with the givens we have here, we could measure very carefully all of the contours of this bar before and after this rearrangement. We could measure each piece. We could multiply the dimensions together, get the volume, compare the volume of the chocolate before and after, and what do you suppose we'd discover in so doing? It would have decreased by exactly 1 square. Or we could use geometry there, we could use physics, we could bring a scale in, weigh the before and the after. I think we all know what we would discover doing that as well. We could use chemistry. This would be a little more involved, but we could get a calorimeter and cause it to undergo combustion before and after, at least a similar one after. We wouldn't have the same one anymore. And we could measure the amount of calories in the bar before and after, and I think you all know what we conclude by doing that. Do we need to do any of that? We don't need to bother with any of that. Why? Exactly. I mean, you could. There's nothing wrong with doing any of that. That would be fun for some people. I only bring up those 3 topics because those are courses I've taught before: physics, math, and chemistry. And as great as they are, I do prefer this course to those because we don't actually need, in this case, those are very useful pursuits, don't get me wrong. Glad we have them. But I don't think anyone here would bother with any of those methods to disprove infinite free chocolate, because we can defer to something even more basic still than any of those undertakings. We can defer to the very foundation of those undertakings. We have something, Hope called it, logic and absolutely. What else could we call that something that we defer to conclude that we cannot have infinite free chocolate? Common sense, thank you, exactly. Common sense. We have this thing called common sense, and it tells us with, I dare say, certainty that we cannot generate infinite free chocolate by rearranging the parts. there's a specific element of common sense that we use to come to that particular conclusion, and we'll get to that shortly. But I assume we're all on the same page here with at least that basic approach, that common sense would be sufficient for at least this problem before us, even if not most problems. So that brings up the next question, though. And that next question happens to be the first one on the discussion sheet. Let me turn the lights back on. And I have some handouts for you, but I'll give them to you, and we'll take a break about halfway through the class, and I'll give you all the handouts. Oh, wait, let me get you that right now, actually, yeah. I've got a bunch of other handouts that I give to people at Class 1, but I can give those to you. Oh, you got that already? Oh, yeah, I emailed that out. Yeah, okay, so you're all set. Yeah, cool. All right, so common sense, yes, important. But the first thing we have on this first discussion sheet is something we should discuss. Why philosophy? Why not just common sense? So first of all, let me turn this projector off. Why not just common sense? Most intro phil classes probably skip this whole discussion that we're having right now because they understandably assume that if you sign up for a philosophy course, you at least are kind of on board with the general idea of doing philosophy, and that's probably the case. But I know that the very idea of philosophy is rejected by more and more people. And I think it's good to start studying philosophy with first considering why we bother having this study at all, so we know we're not just wasting our time. So why not just common sense? This is maybe one of the more common objections to why bother with philosophy, why not just have common sense? And I don't want to in the least denigrate the importance of common sense. Some philosophies, unworthy of the name, do precisely that. It's like the weirder you can be, the cooler you are in some philosophical circles. But I abhor that approach to philosophy. I believe that philosophy should explain common sense, not explain it away. So we certainly need it. We certainly need it as our foundation. But I like to ask my students another little riddle here in our first significant class to illustrate why maybe common sense alone isn't enough to answer all the questions that we'll try to answer with philosophy. You all have at least one piece of paper on your desk, and ponder this question for a moment. If you had a piece of paper, and if you could fold it in half, once, twice, 3 times, I'm folding in half each of these times, so I've done it 3 times so far. If you could do that 100 times, you can't obviously, but just if you could fold it in half 100 times, how thick do you think it would be? Just a common, don't think too long and hard about it, but just a quick common sense type gut instinct thought. Anybody have any thoughts who hasn't heard this little riddle before?
100 times the regular.
Okay, so 100 times the thickness. There's one answer. Any other thoughts? You don't have to give a guess, but I'd be interested to hear any others. Did you have one?
No.
Oh.
I mean, my thought was that if you fold 100 times and press to get it that way, so
You won't be able to,
it
yeah.
would be as flat as the press to get.
Okay, yeah. You would certainly need a lot of tools. Now you're onto something. So, anyone want to just toss a measurement on, just as a common sense type gut instinct? 6 inches, all right.
So you get 1, then you double it.
Uh-huh.
Then once you fold that half or the folded sheet, you get 4 times.
Uh-huh.
Then it goes up and back.
You see, you're starting to really philosophize now, and that's good. That's good. You're actually beating me to my point, which is we need a rigorous approach to this because common sense is not going to give us a good. So, by the way, I'm about to give you what I think the answer is to this, but before I do so, I'll just I readily admit that when I was first asked this question, I was as off as you could possibly be. So don't any of you feel bad if your common sense thought is just a little off as well. I believe that a piece of paper, a standard 0.1 millimeter thick piece of paper, if you could fold it in half 100 times, I believe that it would be approximately 13 billion light years thick. That's what I think. about as big as the universe. A little bit smaller than the universe. So that sounds crazy. And I thought it sounded utterly crazy too when I first heard it. But then let's take Vic's approach here. And 0.1 is the original thickness. That's how thick it is to start off with. You fold it in half once, it's how thick after you fold it in half once? Twice that. You fold it in half again, it's twice that. We don't have to actually do this 100 times because we have exponents. Now, if anyone has a calculator handy, you could toss that into it on your phone or something. And maybe I'll spare you the calculation right now, but no, maybe I won't spare you the calculation. Maybe I'll do this calculation because I have a phone, I believe. Yeah, here we go. Can't help it. You got one? You got an answer?
1.2676506 times 10 to the 20.
Times 10 to the what? 20. 29. Okay. So this is millimeters. Let me try something now. I don't know if this is going to work, but sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't when I try this. Okay, Google. Convert 1.26 times 10 to the 29th millimeters to light years. Is it going to do it? .3 times 10 to the 10 light years. That's what it says. That's in light years. Move the decimal point over 1, you take 1 away from here, that's to the 9th. 10 to the 9th is a billion, 13 billion. If you could fold a piece of paper in half 100 times, it would be 13 billion light years thick. Common sense doesn't exactly tell you that. It doesn't mean common sense wasn't absolutely essential for that process. It was. Common sense tells you that when you fold a piece of paper in half, what happens to its thickness? That it doubles. You need that common sense instinct to even begin working on that question. But the conclusion to the line of reason, common sense, and here's what we can maybe have down. Common sense gives us the absolutely necessary starting points. You can't even start attacking that problem if you don't have that common sense instinct about the thickness doubling. But what does it not do? Well, common sense must not be extrapolated beyond its proper domain. Because it does not give the conclusions. It gives the starting points. Now, you could protest, understandably so, to say, but that doesn't say anything about philosophy because that's a math question, not a philosophy question. Well, it is a math question, but maybe not at first. Well, let me ask this. What, in your experience, is the hardest type of math question? I don't mean like the hardest class or the hardest unit. I mean the hardest category of question. Okay, proofs, yeah. What else? Anybody have word problems? Yeah. That's what I've always found. are the hardest for the highest number of students, word problems. And in the hundreds and hundreds of students I've tutored and taught in math, that's the single problem type that the most have struggled with. And understandably so, because they're not math problems. They're philosophy problems. And philosophy is a lot harder than math. A philosophical problem is one where you're just thrown into a situation. All you have to fall back on is your logic, your common sense, your reason. You need to look at the situation, figure out what's going on, figure out what you know about it, figure out what you don't know, figure out how to know what you know, and to distinguish how you know that you know what you know from what you don't know if you know. That's all philosophy. And that's why word problems are very hard, because they're math problems, but they begin as philosophy problems. And then once you get an equation on your sheet of paper, then it becomes a math problem, and then it's a little easier. So we actually begin those questions with something that is outside of the domain of mathematics. We have to begin with our philosophical instincts there. So that's common. There's just a little illustration I like to give because it tends to stick in people's minds with why common sense alone, if we extrapolate it beyond its proper domain of giving starting points, tends to lead to error. And I think we all know that because we've all heard people say something stupid and say it's just common sense. You've heard that before. Someone says something utterly absurd, and because they don't have any good reason for it, they just pretend it's common sense, and of course it's not. But still, that's what happens when we even at least pretend that common sense gives all sorts of conclusions to reasoning processes that it really only gives the starting points for. Okay, so we need it, but we mustn't extrapolate it too far. But what's next? Well, let me do some erasing. With this particular issue with common sense, it's just that we don't have a good instinct for how exponential growth works, because it's exponential. There was a judge, I believe this is a true story, who gave someone a fine for a relatively small offense, but he knew this guy was a ne'er-do-well and wouldn't pay it. So he said, this fine is going to double every day that you don't pay it. It was only a few pennies, the fine, for some very minor infraction. The guy didn't pay it for a couple months, and what happened? He owed like the national debt or something, which he didn't have to pay the national debt, but that's what happens with exponential growth. Anyway, why not just something else? Well, maybe there's one more. There's a bunch of objections. If we can't deal with all of them, I'd just like to start our unit here with considering one more objection to philosophy as something to bother with at all. Why not just what? Has anyone heard another common objection to the study of philosophy? Why not just? Sorry? Okay, why not just ignore? That's a good point. Maybe that is more common than the one I have in mind now. Maybe why not just apathy is an even more common objection, perhaps. Although I suppose those who are apathetic don't even bother saying why not be apathetic. They just are apathetic. How to deal with apathy is quite a paradox. There's something that I have in mind now is what receives over 99% of higher education funding from the government. I think it's 99.6, something like that. Exactly. Why not just science? Now, I'm a big fan of science. I originally was an engineer. I am still an engineer, in fact. I went to RPI. That was my first profession. Still love it. Still a big fan of it. Still a big fan of science and engineering and technology. But I often hear this levied against philosophy. Why not just science? So let's consider this also. You walk into, here's another illustration. You walk into your friend's house and there is a pot of water boiling on the stove, and you say to your friend, why is that pot of water boiling? and your friend says, well, it's a steel container. It's got a bunch of H2O molecules in it. There's heat rushing up through the bottom of it because of the electric filament that's thousands of degrees Fahrenheit. That's exciting the H2O molecules to such an extent, it's imparted such kinetic energy to them that they're vibrating back and forth so quickly that they've actually reached the point where their momentum is exceeding the vapor pressure of the air on top of it. Thus, particles are escaping and the water is boiling. Is he correct? Yeah, that is correct. That is why the water is boiling. Is that what you wanted to know? No. You did not want to know that. What did you want to know? Yeah, you wanted to know what's for dinner. You didn't want to know it. You didn't want a chemistry lesson, even though that was a correct answer to your question. It was not the one you wanted. Because there are multiple ways to answer the same question, and as long as they are not contradictory, they can both be correct. Aristotle calls this the four causes. And we'll go over the details of that later in the course if we have time. But I'll just run through real quick right now. We've got the material cause, the formal cause, the efficient cause, and the final cause. And science, empirical science, science in the broadest sense of the word, the traditional sense of the word, just means any reasoned discourse, in which case philosophy would also be a science. But when we say science today, we tend to mean the scientific method and empirical approaches. And those type of approaches deal only with a couple, two or three maybe, of the four causes, but they certainly cannot deal with what we usually want to know, which is the final cause, the ultimate why of things. Material, formal, efficient, and final. And I do plan to actually go over those later in the course. I hope we have time to. Kind of depends on how things go. I have a structure for the course, certainly, but I just don't like to pin it down in too much detail, because it just feels wrong to do that. And it forces us to rush through things that maybe deserve a little more time, depending upon how conversations go. And anyway, I do hope to go into more detail on that later. But if those are the four causes, if Aristotle is right, then that final cause is the why of a thing. And how do we determine the why of a thing? Well, there's a number of ways we can attack that question, but I think we can at least confidently say that an empirical approach, that is to say a scientific approach, simply doesn't have what it takes to give the answer to that final why. If you had the best electron microscope in the world and you put that pot of boiling water under it and you figured out everything about the H2O molecules in there, and would that tell you what's for dinner? No, it doesn't matter how good of an electron microscope you have. It doesn't matter how many details you can discover about that pot of water. The answer lies outside the pot of water. You got to think outside the pot. Just give advice in more ways than one there. What do you have to do? Let's say your friend isn't there and you want to discover what's for dinner. Yeah, you have to look around at other places, this is an analogy, so no analogy is perfect, but you have to use metaphysical methods. If the pot of water represents that which is accessible to the empirical approaches of science, if you want to know what's for dinner, you got to look and see what's out on the counter, what's in the cabinets, what utensils are out. All of those things will give you clues about the deepest why of the pot of water. The why was it put on the stove in the first place. That's like philosophy. Looking outside the pot of water is what we do when we do what's called metaphysics. Trying to look for, metaphysics does not mean supernatural, does not mean theological. It just means you're still using pure reason, but you're trying to figure out answers using everything accessible to your reason, not just things accessible to your microscope, which is important, but it's only a part of your reason. It's very important, but still just a part. So what can we have down about this? Well, empirical science cannot address all four causes. Empirical science also is a tool. that does not know how to direct itself. In other words, science cannot tell you how science ought to be used. Any examples of when that principle is neglected? Okay, yeah, there's a good example. What we have, we have to think about whether, if we kind of lump science and technology in together for a moment, we have to decide whether a given technology is actually good. Technology in and of itself is good, of course. I'm a big fan of technology. But that doesn't necessarily mean that an individual technology is actually being successfully ordered to the good in a given case. We have to ask questions that are philosophical in nature. What specific subset of philosophy do we have to make sure we carefully apply to technological questions of that sort? Ethics. Philosophical ethics needs to be very zealously undertaken to determine what should be done with the technology that science gives us the ability to generate. Data does not interpret itself. Data, and I'm going to put that down. No mere data interprets itself. Data is very important. But a data set cannot tell you what that data set means. A data set cannot tell you what can be concluded from that data set. Statistics can be incredibly helpful, or they can be incredibly deceptive. I think we all know that. I think we've all seen statistics used deceptively to try and manipulatively promote any absurd conclusion that the propagandists want to promote with it. Instead, we need the data, yes, but we need a scope that goes beyond the data, beyond the empirical approaches, to give it context, to give it meaning, and to give it an ethical direction. Okay. So when we get to those deepest, the deepest of the deep why questions, where we're in a domain that science certainly can help, it can certainly give good data to deepen the understanding of certain things with, but it can't give the answers. The most important questions of our lives don't actually have a huge amount to do with anything in science, do they? And again, I say this as a big fan of science, as an engineer myself, but it would be rather useless for me as an engineer to spend much time in my engineering textbooks to determine who to marry. I mean, I've already determined that, so I'll never have to determine that again, but I didn't waste much time in my engineering textbooks then some years ago when I was making that decision, because I knew it wasn't a scientific decision, it wasn't an engineering decision. It was beyond those things. It was addressing questions that were far deeper than science or technology could answer for me. And our lives are inundated with questions like that every single day. And we can choose to live not even bothering with them, what Socrates calls the unexamined life. And he has a famous quote in The Unexamined Life. Has anyone heard it before? Exactly. That's probably his most famous quote. And we'll talk a lot about Socrates in future classes, but his famous quote, "The unexamined life is not worth living." And that doesn't mean if you don't examine your life, kill yourself. That's not what he means. He means, please examine your life, because you are a being with the ability to do so. Therefore, only a life in which that is done is a life worthy of your calling as a human being. We must examine. We must try to answer as best we can, even if we can't fully answer them all. Of course, we won't be able to. Socrates doesn't have all the answers. I certainly don't either. But we have the ability to try as best we can to answer them, so try we must. Otherwise, we're just living life thoughtlessly, without examination, And as Chesterton said, any dead thing can go with the flow. It takes a living thing to swim against it. All right. So hopefully we're somewhat convinced of the general need for philosophy. But I'd still like to throw one more reason out there, and you don't need to put this down anywhere, but if anyone's still unconvinced about philosophy's importance, there's one final point I'd like to make on that. And I'm going to draw one more illustration for that point. Suppose you really hate weapons. And I'm not intending to make any political point with this one way or the other, by the way, but just suppose you hate weapons so much that you just want to get rid of all of them. What might be one problem? Okay, yeah, there's one problem. Anything could be a weapon, and that's certainly valid a point. What else? But what else might be a problem? Exactly. There are weapons, and there's bad people who have them, right? So at the very minimum, we hope to be able to what? At the very minimum, we hope we can at least have enough ability to use weapons so as to stop those who would use them unjustly. And I'm not saying weapons are good. I'm just using this as an illustration. Even if you hated weapons, let's just pretend philosophy is like weapons. It's not. Let's pretend it is for a moment. Even if you just hate the thought of philosophy, at the very minimum, no one can deny that there are bad philosophers, and there is bad philosophy. And if we don't bother with philosophy, then what are we doing to that and to them? Letting that, what's that? Yeah, we're accepting it tacitly. We are just allowing it to flourish. Most of the biggest, most significant things that happen in the world, you trace back you follow the causal chain back far enough, the chain of inspiration, like what inspired that to happen, what inspired that person to do that, and if you follow that back far enough, it usually doesn't take long at all. I found that you can usually trace it back to a philosopher, for better or for worse. And it's not always for better. Whether or not we want to philosophize, there are Hitlers out there who, and I'm not blaming the philosopher entirely for this. I know that Hitler twisted his work to some degree, but also the philosopher is not without blame. Does anyone know? What philosopher in particular Hitler found the most inspiration from? Nietzsche, Friedrich Nietzsche. Existential nihilism. This sort of triumph of will, the autonomy of will, the need for the will to break the bonds of truth and right and wrong and exert its own dominance over all things. That is the essence of the kind of Mein Kampf approach to politics and society. And it's not just Nietzsche. There's every tyrant for a couple hundred years has been inspired by Machiavelli, and there's so many more, and we'll touch on many of them throughout this course, but there is bad philosophy, and it must be refuted at the very minimum. We must refute bad philosophy. So you might say, well, it's too late. There already was the Hitler, and he already inspired these genocides that killed so many millions. Well, yes, we can't change the past, but what can we do? There's Hitlers out there right now. They just don't have enough power yet to actually act upon their bad philosophy. And if we refute it when it's young enough, if we refute bad philosophy when it is small enough, we at least have the hope of preventing it from exploding onto the world stage and wreaking the destruction that it always will if it's given the opportunity to do so, as it largely was throughout the 20th century, the bloodiest century in the history of the world, largely because of the bad philosophies that were running the show. And they were not sufficiently refuted in their day. And they have largely been refuted now. Many of, you won't find too many people defending Nietzsche's existential nihilism anymore, although unfortunately you will find some. But there's the next round of bad philosophies out there that haven't been sufficiently refuted. All right, so why we need it? There we go. There's a few thoughts. How about how we do it? In what does philosophy begin? what does the word itself mean, and what does this etymology say about its nature? All right. A little more erasing. I've spent years here at Hudson Valley using these. And I don't know what these are, but they're unworthy of the name eraser. So I bought my own eraser. I went on Amazon and I found one that actually had good reviews, and this actually seems to be working. So finally, I can erase. And I say that just so you guys know that I'm not stealing this when I put it in my bag at the end of the day. It is mine. I bought it. I bring it to class so I can actually erase the chalkboard, which I never have been able to do for years now. Anyhow, there it is. Okay, in what does it begin? Well, Socrates has another great quote here. He says this: philosophy begins in wonder. That's not how most academic pursuits begin, I must say. Or maybe it is, I don't know, maybe I shouldn't say that. It's not how most career paths begin, I suppose I could say that much. So what does that mean it doesn't begin? It doesn't begin in career aspirations, it doesn't begin in desire for money, it doesn't begin in desire for fame, it doesn't begin in desire to win arguments. Philosophy, if it is to be done rightly, must begin in wonder. Begin in the sense of that's what inspires it. So wonder, what is wonder? What's that? Yeah, certainly. Yeah. Pondering, absolutely. What else can we compare it to? Yeah, that's kind of what you want to know when you have this sense of wonder. But what wonder itself, what would you categorize it as? Yeah, exactly. It's not an ulterior motive. It is not because you want something else out of it. It's sincere and genuine, and it's a type of emotion, and that's okay. Emotion is not unworthy of philosophy. Although the rationalism would say precisely that. We'll address that next week. In fact, philosophy itself begins in something outside of itself, as all things do. But wonder is like an emotion of awe. You look out upon the world, upon your own psyche, upon yourself, upon other people, upon society. You look out, you experience reality, and you are in awe. You're amazed. You have a sense of wonder, and you just have a sincere desire to know more about this stunning reality that you are immersed in, by no choice of your own, but just by the mere fact that you exist. So you have a sincere amazement and a desire to know things about what you see. It's childlike in that sense, and that's a good thing. It must be like that. It must begin in wonder. If you're going to do philosophy right, you got to make sure it's beginning in wonder. And if you haven't felt wonder in a while, then go out and make sure you feel it. How? How can we feel wonder? Doesn't require a drug. It's something we don't see enough of today.
Go out and see something different.
See something different? There's a certain something we see very little of because of how much light there is.
See something you've never seen before.
Something you've never seen before, yeah. Something new. Something not on a screen, preferably. Seeing something directly. Experiencing something directly. Not on social media, not on any screen of any sort. Look up at the stars at night. Go on a walk in nature. Experience something that's going to give you genuine, sincere wonder. And you'll actually start to want to know more things than you know. And that's the beginning of philosophy. You can't do philosophy if you never have that sense, that genuine, sincere inspiration of wonder and awe. Childlike. So it begins in wonder, but that's certainly not enough. You can't just sit there being in awe of things and call yourself a philosopher. You need a little bit more than that, because we need to look at the etymology of the word itself. Philosophy. All right. It's two words in one. Philo and Sophia. What does philo mean? Close? Close? If you philo something, you love it. Philo is love. it's the same. Some words have phile in them, and that's actually love. But this means love in the pure sense of the word. It's not perverse in any way. Sophia, what does that mean? It's a name. It's a woman's name, but it also means wisdom. I think I heard that. Wisdom. Okay. So philosophy, quite simply, is the love of wisdom. You can't always look at the etymology of a word and thereby ascertain its meaning, but here you can. And its etymology both gives us its meaning and says something very important about it, especially with respect to the philo part. I don't know how many other academic pursuits have philo in their name. I don't know if any do. I just haven't thought about it before, actually. But most of them have ology, or something like that, something with a Latin root, maybe, that means the same thing. If you have an ology after something, biology, physiology, psychology, the ology comes from the Greek word logos, which is word, or it is an ordered account. To give a logos of something is to give an ordered account of it, is to study it under the presupposition that it is an ordered whole, and that ordered whole can be discovered through reason. So that's what we always mean when we put an ology after something. It is an ordered whole, and we can discover that order through reason. And philosophy is that, yes. But we don't call it sophiology. Instead, we call it philosophy. Because more than a knowledge, even more than a reasoned understanding, philosophy is and must be a love. It can't just be the knowledge. It's got to be the love. Wisdom. I think we have an intuitive understanding of that. A wisdom. If we have wisdom. Whoops. I miss letters and parts of letters all the time. I will never be offended if you point that out. When we have a wisdom, we have an understanding of the truth of the matter and a willingness and a desire to live by that truth and discover more about that truth, wisdom. But love, well, we all know what that means, but when is it not shown? Well, if philosophy is a love, and of course it is, then when is it not had? Well, if someone if somebody is never there for you, doesn't want to give up anything for you, doesn't want to sacrifice anything of himself for you, doesn't really care about what you need, doesn't even want to get up off the couch to do anything for you, and he says, "I love you," do you believe him? No. Why? Yeah, because love is what? Yeah, it's proven by what? Actions, deeds. That's true in relationships, and that's true with all loves. It is proven not by anything nominal, not by knowledge either. It's proven by actions. In this case, we can say confidently that it is a way of life. Philosophy is, above all, a way of life. It is not merely knowing all sorts of supposed philosophical facts in the textbook. Most of the people, in fact, who call themselves philosophers should really be called sophiologists, because they don't live in accordance with the wisdom that they're pursuing. They just pursue the wisdom so that they can have jobs at universities. But a philosopher, in a proper sense of the word, is one who loves wisdom, and therefore it is one who lives in accordance with the wisdom he or she discovers. Philosophy requires, for it to be real, the genuine desire to uncover the truth, but also the what? The firm commitment to live in accordance with with what you discover, come what may, no matter how hard it is, no matter how countercultural it is. You're not a philosopher if, when you have exercised your reason as zealously as you can, and thereby come to discover a truth, you're only a philosopher if you then choose to live by that truth. Otherwise, you're just a sophiologist, which, again, unfortunately, I would not hesitate to say most so-called philosophers are. because too often philosophy is just used to rationalize what everyone wants to do. But that's, of course, not what it should be used for. So it's a way of life, begins in wonder, means the love of wisdom. Awesome. But how do we, practically speaking, begin with it? How does philosophy begin? With what does philosophy proceed? And at what is it directed? All right. Another illustration. You wake up one morning, and unfortunately you have forgotten the meaning of every word. What do you do first? You go get a dictionary. So you need to rediscover the meaning of all these words that you forgot the meanings of. So you open up to the first word that you want to, God bless you, remember the meaning of, and what's your first problem? You don't know what the words next to it mean. Well, you just look those up. What's the next problem? You don't know what those definitions, words mean either. So what are you going to be stuck doing? You're going to be going through this dictionary for all eternity. God bless you. The same, you're going to be just circling through it forever. This is called the dictionary paradox. Language, in other words, does not start with language. It starts with what? I mean, you have to think back chronologically a ways, but how are we capable of speaking? Semiotics. Expound. What? Semiotics. So how actually do we begin? Exactly. Pictures, yeah. What's that? Yeah. Yeah. Something, in other words, something in what? Concrete reality. We can't have language without first beginning with something that is itself outside of language, prior to language. You're able to use words because before you had the use of words, you had the use of what? Senses. Exactly. It's just a matter of thinking back a far enough number of years in your past. You can call this a desk because you first saw a desk and your mom gave you the word desk for the thing that you observed with your senses. So you know you have that symbol now, the word desk. What about philosophy? So language can't begin with language, long story short. Everything begins with something outside of itself. So what does philosophy begin with? Yeah, it begins with wonder in terms of what inspires us to philosophize, but I mean in another sense of the word begin now. I mean, how do we actually, in philosophy we want certainty. We want certainty about the conclusions we come to. How do we start even seeking after that certainty then?
We have to start with a question.
We have to start with a question, certainly. And we start trying to answer that question by deferring to something that we already have before philosophizing. Because philosophy cannot begin with philosophizing, because that would be circular, just like the dictionary paradox.
Do we start with things that we know, for example, like you said that we went through their cabinets before we looked at everything, we still don't know the real answer.
Yeah. Okay, yeah, so you're onto something there. To begin philosophizing practically, concretely, we have to actually go back to what we started with several minutes ago, maybe 45 minutes ago at this point. Common sense. But now that we're actually trying to engage in philosophy a little more zealously, we have to ask ourselves, what are the constituents of common sense? Well, there's something called the first principles. The first principles are those things, they are elements of common sense includes more than just the first principles, but these are themselves so fundamental and so basic that philosophy can't prove them. But that doesn't mean they are not certain. That means that they're even more certain than everything else philosophy proves. So, an example of geometry. You begin doing geometry. So you're going through geometry all these weeks in the course, And you're proving all these theorems, theorem after theorem after theorem, you're proving with such certainty, with such rigor that you have those conclusions, those theorems in your head with certainty. But where do you start with? In the very beginning of the textbook, and scattered throughout, new ones were introduced. Exactly, axioms or postulates. They are geometric. They are these propositions that are so basic in geometry that geometry itself can't prove them. They have to be taken for granted, not because they're in any way uncertain, but just because any being with reason can easily see the truth thereof. And it doesn't need to be proven, and it can't be. A line is that which is determined by 2 points, things like that. A point is that which has no part, as Euclid said thousands of years ago. But that's just geometry. We want to do more than just geometry. We want to philosophize. So we need more first principles than geometric ones. We need the first principles of reason more generally. We need starting points that are true, but so basic that they cannot be proven. And you actually deferred to one of these in your conviction that you could not get infinite free chocolate. Common sense, yes, but what particular constituent of your common sense was it that gave you such conviction that you could not get infinite free chocolate?
You have a set amount, you take something away, you cannot have the same amount.
Exactly. And that's another way of saying one of the most basic first principles, which is this: the whole is greater than the part. You know that. You simply know that. But you can't prove it. I mean, you can give all sorts of examples where it's validated. You can talk about how much sense it makes. You can write books showing that no counterexample can be shown. But you can't, strictly speaking, prove these things because they are themselves the starting points of proofs. It just wouldn't make any sense to even try to prove them. This doesn't mean we can't talk about why they make sense. It just means they can't, strictly speaking, be the conclusions of proofs.
But isn't there a thing called proof by contradiction?
Yeah, so what is proof by contradiction?
Proof is a law, so if you break a law, it's not proof. Right.
Well, so that would be a counterexample, would be something that disproves a supposed proof. Proof by contradiction would be something called the reductio ad absurdum, where we say, if blank, then blank. So a proof by contradiction is when you say, if A, then B. But B is absurd. Therefore, what can we say about A? Exactly, it can't be true. If B necessarily follows from A, then B's absurdity also demonstrates A's absurdity. And you all use this logical method intuitively. When your friend says something stupid, you say to your friend, okay, by that logic, blank. And you put something ridiculous in the blank, and that proves to your friend, hopefully, that your friend said something stupid. So yeah, that's certainly a valid logical approach. I don't suppose that you could... Yeah, no, I suppose that would certainly work in illustrating why these first principles work. It wouldn't strictly be considered a proof of them, I don't suppose, though. But yeah, I'm glad you bring that up. And we're going to use that a lot throughout various Socratic dialogues. And you can certainly show how much sense it makes by using various reductio ad absurdums. The whole is greater than the part. We know that. You can't get more out of something than is there. There's plenty more. But here's the ironic thing. There's no agreed upon list of first principles. This is a problem. That philosophy has no simple, and this is the irony, this is the paradoxical nature of philosophy. It's that what should be the most absolutely certain things are also hotly contested. So it's difficult to even know how to talk with someone. To be completely honest, I'll be just open here. very difficult to even know how to engage in a dialogue with someone who rejects what's clearly a first principle, because you need to use the first principles to make any logical headway in anything whatsoever. Like, there are some so-called logicians out there today, professional philosophers of logic, who reject some of the first principles of reason. And I think it's really just that they haven't realized, they haven't done enough of this. They haven't realized what else follows from their attempt to reject a first principle. They haven't realized how much absurdity follows. You know what one problem might be? They might reject the very approach of proof by contradiction, which we know the validity of a proof by contradiction is itself a first principle. We simply know that that works. It does work, and you know it works. You have to recognize that you know it works in order to use it, though. And other people have to recognize that it works in order for it to be used against them. But at the end of the day, everything we're doing here is very important, and it can bear much fruit. But at the end of the day, there's nothing you can do to show someone who's not being honest with himself the truth.
Does that mean you reject everything if you never be proved wrong?
Yeah, well, that's what we're going to see some of the earliest Greek philosophers did. Actually, we're not going to get to that until next class, but we're still going to try to address it. And I think we can address it. But still, there does always come a point where someone could be stubborn enough that if they're not going to be honest with themselves, no argument will work. And I think we've all had plenty of experiences of that in our own lives. There is no there's no logical cure for stubbornness. I suppose it's I don't know. Let me know if you figure it out. Anyway, there are some more first principles, thankfully, we can defer to. No effect is greater than its cause. This is a little more perplexing to some people, understandably so. Many of the physical laws of motion, many of the laws that we study in physics, are really just corollaries of this more general first principle of reason. Maybe some of you recall from physics class, the teacher, has anyone been in a physics class where the teacher holds a bowling ball right here, or a basketball maybe if he's not as brave, on a string, tethered to an anchor in the ceiling? Has anyone even seen a video of this? Okay. So he holds it right here, right next to his face, and he lets it go. And what next? It doesn't move. Why? It's speeding out his head. Exactly. And what physics teachers always do, because, I mean, as they should, they're teaching physics, is they describe this in terms of Newton's laws of motion, his kinematics, and it's perfectly fine. You don't need Newton's kinematics to explain why that works. All you need is a logical first principle, no effect is greater than its cause. The energy in that bowling ball is entirely due to him holding it up at this level. As long as he doesn't impart more energy to it, as long as he doesn't give it more causality there, it can't somehow magically get more causality out of the process after he releases it. It's simple logic. It's physics, yes, but it's even more basic. It's logic. Now, if he accidentally, problems can happen here. You could say, well, hold on, maybe this first principle is wrong, because I've seen that experiment happen, and I've seen physics teachers get broken noses. How's that explained? Exactly. He either accidentally pushed it a little bit, so we're not properly identifying the cause. You know, every time we might think that one of these doesn't apply, it's not that it doesn't apply, it's that we've neglected some aspect of the situation. He either pushed it a little bit accidentally, or what? Or raised it a little bit, or leaned forward as it was swinging. That's the more common one even. So, because it's hard to stay perfectly still, obviously. No, we all know that no effect is greater than its cause. If the cause of the... So why do you not ever expect to be able to go cross-country road trip having only put a couple gallons of gas in your car? What is the cause of the motion of your car when you're driving? The gasoline you put in the engine, you know that you're not going to get more energy out of your car than is in the gasoline you put in the tank. That's its cause. If it seems that you got more miles per gallon than you should, you don't conclude that the first principle of reason was violated. You conclude that maybe your particular trip was more downhill than uphill, or maybe the wind was blowing at your back more of the time. You don't suppose the first principle is violated. The problem is there's nothing to prevent any, and I'm a big fan of good fiction, don't get me wrong, but there's nothing to prevent anything from happening in fiction. A work of fiction could have these violated, which is why I refuse to watch or read works of fiction where I know they're going to violate one of these, because as soon as one of these is violated, you can't even think logically about the plot. And I want to read a story I can think about, not one that I don't want to just waste 2 hours of my life. When is this one often? Oh, I'm sorry, I have to write down one more, and then you'll know what I'm getting at here. No effect. What else can we say about effects and causes? Exactly. No effect precedes its cause. Often violated in what types of fictional works? Yeah, and I like science fiction, but when we have individual... I watched a movie a couple of years ago where the whole twist ending was that the effect of a cause was itself the cause of that cause, which is what a lot of time travel movies do. And it makes absolutely no logical sense. You can't think about that. There's no way you can think about the effect of a cause itself being the cause of that cause. It's just, you might as well have just thrown away 2 hours of your life. I mean, maybe it was some good eye candy, but it certainly wasn't anything mentally engaging in a significant way, at least not in that aspect of its plot. So there's, let's see, what else can we say here? The law of non-contradiction, probably the most basic of all. There's a number of ways of formulating the law of non-contradiction. Contradictory assertions. Contradictory assertions cannot be made of the same thing. And there's two other conditions here. You don't even have to have this definition down. I'm not going to ask you for this in the final, but now I feel like I have to finish it. This is not going to be pretty. I have to squeeze it into about 2 inches of height here. Contradictory assertions cannot be made of the same thing at the same time in the same aspect. Wow. All right. This is a bit perplexing as well. You might say, well, hold on. A cup of coffee could be hot and cold. In what sense? Yeah, it could be hot in comparison to your hand as you're holding it, but it would be cold in comparison to the filament in the coffee maker if you put it back on to heat it up. And that's absolutely true. Those are contradictory qualities. Hot and cold are opposites, or they're obviously contradictory. They're said of the same thing at the same time, but you're referring to different aspects of the same thing. The same cup of coffee could be hot and cold at different times. It's hot once it's made, it's cold later on maybe. But if you're talking about the same thing at the same time, the same aspect, it doesn't make any sense to assert blatant contradictions of it. One or the other must be chosen. Your age, you might be young and old. Maybe you're young compared to your grandmother and you're old compared to your grandchild. Don't suppose too many people have that many generations alive at the same time, although some of my family members do. But your age cannot be both, your age and years cannot be both even and odd. They're contradictories. So again, we all know this. These are the things that we defer to whenever we're trying to figure out a situation. Whenever we're trying to analyze an argument, whenever we're trying to discover the truth, these are the principles that we always defer to no matter what. And we all know that we have no right to violate them because these are the starting points of reason. These are the bedrock of reason. We start with them. And then what do we do with them? There's others also. I don't want to go through all the first principles. Although I do have 2 more I like to talk about. Some people would say these aren't so much first principles, but I think they're close enough. Something could fail to qualify as a first principle either because it's provable, in which case it's true, but it's not technically a first principle, or because it's not true, then it's certainly not a first principle. But here's two very important things to keep in mind for the duration of philosophy, and it has to do with chains. Okay, so here's a chain. This is not usually how one goes about working on cars, but I suppose it's possible. Really strong chain, really big, thick links holding this car up. Really big link, and there's another link, and really big, strong link there holding up this car. And you guys can see why I'm not an art professor now. There you go. Are you going to work under that car? But it's got really strong links here. Look at how strong these links are. You're not going to work under it? Why not? No chain. Exactly. Every chain is only as strong as its weakest link. Now, I just, obviously, to phrase it technically appropriately as a philosophical first principle, you wouldn't use images, but I'm going to do that because it makes sense. Chains, it's just very intuitive to think of chains and links. We all know that every chain is only as strong as its weakest link. We must always remember that when we're looking at any argument, because we're going to look at the sophists next class. They were experts at persuasion in all the wrong ways. And what is one of the primary tools of a sophist? One of the primary tools of a sophist is to add tons of really strong links for like a really long time in hopes that you'll what? Exactly, in hopes that you'll forget that way back there was a really weak link. That whole chain is useless because it had one really weak link in there. Another quasi-first principle, if not absolute first principle, I'm going to use a similar analogy, one that you probably haven't heard, but it's just as important. Instead of it being about a chain, this time it's about a rope. And if you know how ropes work, well, ropes are a combination of a bunch of what? Yeah, individual fibers or strands. So we also have to remember that every rope is at least as strong as what? Yeah, and not only that, but it's at least as strong as its what fiber? Its strongest. A rope is at least as strong as its strongest strand. So if this is what you already know, and this is a conclusion, and this is the reasoning process you use to get to it, it's common, this is a red herring, it's common to see people find one strand that's really weak and direct a bunch of attention to that in hopes that they'll what? Yeah, in hopes that that'll distract you from all of the really strong strands that each do the job perfectly fine on their own. So these are converse, these principles are both equally important, but they are the converse of each other. Neglecting to realize how weak a link there is in a chain will make you overvalue the strength of a conclusion. Neglecting to realize the strength of an individual strand will cause you to neglect how strong a conclusion is. And both are, of course, fallacies that we have to avoid. All right, so those are the starting points, the first principles of reason. But that's just the starting point. Although, by the way, I should throw out there, these are not enough. These starting points are not enough. We also need something else. I'm going to erase a few things here. Can I erase these, guys? Okay. So first principles of reason, there's a whole genre of philosophers who say that those alone are enough. That if you go sullying philosophy with anything beyond these pure, simple first principles of reason, you have thereby ruined the certainty of your conclusions. It's called idealism, the founder of which was René Descartes. But most philosophers, rightfully so, reject that. The first principles alone are necessary, but they're not sufficient. You also need common sense observation. Sometimes called the unavoidable facts of the universe. Those things that, sure, you can deny if you want to write a fiction novel, but you can't take yourself seriously if you do so. The unavoidable facts of the universe. These are not first principles of reason. So that's the thing. All those things that, you could even call these street smarts if you want. And I certainly sympathize with those philosophers who want to say, no, these are unworthy of philosophy. But at the end of the day, I don't agree with them because we simply do need it. I'm sorry, but you can't decide who to vote for by knowing that the whole is greater than the part and no effect precedes its cause and things like that. You need more. You need to just take for granted those things that clearly should and can be taken for granted. The unavoidable facts of the universe. Now here's the thing. The unavoidable facts of the universe need what to be discovered? What's that? Yeah, those and literal senses also. Like you need to see the world, and you need to just kind of come to know things about how reality works by just living long enough and seeing how the world works and knowing people and hearing people and like just those are like very concrete, fleshy experiences. They're necessary. But an idealist philosopher hates the thought of the senses being necessary. We'll talk more, I'm sure that'll come up more later, but the most famous example of that is Descartes' bent stick thought experiment. You put a stick in the water, and what does it look like happened from your vantage point above the water? It looks like the stick bent. Did it bend? How do you know? But what if it did bend? I mean, I'm not saying it did. I'm just saying, how do you know it didn't? How do you know it wasn't mystical water that bends sticks when you put it in and unbends them when you pull it out? For all Descartes knows, that's what could have happened, except you can do what and conclude that it's not bent? Pull it back out, or while keeping it in, you can what?
Okay.
Feel it, exactly, but that's a what? It's a sense. You can't get away from the senses. We are sensory beings and we cannot escape that. There's simply no escaping the fact that we need the senses to discover truth. Even the very words that we use to express the first principles, they're words. How again did we discover words? By relating them to reality through our senses. We can't get away from the senses. Sorry, Descartes. We do need them. Aristotle's a big fan of the senses. Plato is not. So we'll see their disagreement later in the course, but didn't really mean to go on that tangent there. Anyway, there still are idealist philosophers, but not as many as there were in Descartes' day. Closer to his day, and I unfortunately can't remember who this was or when exactly it was. Some time ago, there was a philosopher who wanted to prove, he was an idealist, and he wanted to prove that he could show who should be the next king of Poland by using the first principles alone with reason applied to them. He published this under a pseudonym, I think, because he knew how ridiculous it was. Unfortunately for him, he was found out, and people rightly laughed at him, because we all know you can't know who the next king of Poland should be by knowing that the whole is greater than the part and things like that. You need common sense observation. We need more starting points than just first principles of reason. As much as we do need those, we need more than just those. All right, so that's what we start with. Once we've started, what do? Well, we use logic, logical discourse. How does that work? Well, it's time for another quick video clip. We're just about ready to take our break, but let's squeeze this in first. So the next thing we can have down under common sense observation, the unavoidable facts of the universe, is that it proceeds with logical discourse. So again, it starts with the first principles of reason and the common sense observation, the unavoidable facts of the universe. It proceeds, that means it gets going, it does its work with logical discourse. So that is what the actual footwork of philosophy is all about, logical discourse. So this is how we do logical discourse.
Oh, just now. No, you didn't. Yes, I did. You did not. I'm sorry, is this a 5 minute or a full half hour? Oh, just a 5 minute. Thank you. Anyway, I did. You most certainly did not. Let's get nothing quite clear. I most definitely told you. You did not. Yes, I did. You did not. Yes, I did. Didn't. Yes, I did. Didn't. Yes, I did. No, this is an argument. Yes, it is. No, it isn't. It's just contradiction. No, it isn't. Yes, it is. It is not. It is. You just contradicted me. No, I didn't. Oh, you did. No. You did, just then. No, nonsense. Oh, look, this is futile. No, it isn't. Okay, make up an argument. No, you didn't try to make up an argument. Well, an argument's not the same as contradiction. Okay. No, it can't. An argument is a collective series of statements to establish a definite proposition. No, it isn't. Yes, it is. It isn't just contradiction. Look, if I argue with you, I must take up a contract position. But it didn't just say no, it didn't. Yes, it did. No, it didn't. Argument is an intellectual process. Contradiction is just an automatic gainsaying of anything the other person says. No, it isn't. Yes, it is. No. Thank you.
So that's how we do it, right? Sorry, I couldn't help myself. Love that little skit. So logical discourse. What on earth does that require to happen? And what perhaps was missing from our little Monty Python video there? What do you have to start with? Okay, so logical discourse, by the way, implies that it's with somebody else. And that's how philosophy works best. With multiple people engaging in logical discourse. I'm being mesmerized by that thing swinging back and forth now. I just have to stop that. All right. So you want to talk with somebody and get somewhere logically. You want to start with what is known, apply logic to what is known, and in that process arrive at conclusions that are true and that neither of you previously knew. It's an incredibly powerful thing. But in order for it to actually happen, it requires what? That you begin with, what's that? Something that you know and that they know. In other words, okay, so we already have down that it proceeds with logical discourse. Which requires shared or agreed premises. I'll put shared premises down. You cannot build truths with other people unless you begin with those premises that both parties to the discourse hold. This is also called what? Shared premises or do I hear it? Or values, certainly. Common ground. Common ground. This isn't just some platitude. This is logically, philosophically necessary. What we saw in that little skit there, which was rather insightful because it's all that tends to happen today, is flat out contradiction. To simply yell contradiction to people at the opposite end of the aisle, that's what we expect to see in politics today, unfortunately. But it's useless because supposed facts, and I say supposed just not because I'm against the idea of facts, but because when you're in the midst of an actual discourse, you do not have the ability to spend all the time necessary to research and prove your individual assertions. So you need to instead bring up those assertions that the other party already holds as their own. And if you begin with this common ground, if you begin with truths that both parties in the discourse share, then and only then can you build one step after the other from that and arrive at a conclusion eventually that both of you will agree on and that will be true. So that's so necessary, but it only happens. It almost never happens today, in fact. It only happens if you have people, first of all, willing to engage in it, willing to not be ideological about it, willing to talk calmly and logically and unemotionally to the other side, willing to see what the other side is saying, willing to restrict them, willing to obey certain ground rules that at least, make this possible to continue. It's kind of the opposite, in other words, of what we see on, I don't know, Twitter. I don't have a Twitter. But all I tend to see when I go on there is people just yelling contradictions at each other, which doesn't do anything. Just yelling contradictions at each other, you can't build anything with that. You can't build truth upon truth upon truth by just contradicting the other side. So what we're missing today, above all, seems to be logical discourse, where both parties can benefit so significantly, if only they're willing to start with what they both hold is true. So practically speaking, how do we do that? Well, when you're with someone, you say, okay, we both believe blank, right? We both hold this as true, right? Yes? Okay, excellent. So that also leads to blank, right? Does it indeed? Okay, yes, so it leads to that. And then you can keep doing that. And as long as you agree on each step, you both hold the conclusions of that process as truths of your own. It's incredibly powerful. But again, it requires certain things that don't tend to happen too much today. So let's get a couple more definitions down. Proceeds with logical discourse, requires shared premises. But what on earth is this logic anyway? I'll save until after our break expounding more on this, but real quick, logic would be the valid operation of reason in the mind. The valid operation of reason in the mind that leads to truth. Truth being the correspondence of thought and reality. Idea, truth is something, of course, in the mind, and when something in your mind is true, that proposition in your mind actually correlates to the way it is in reality. Of course, it's not necessarily that way. So, how on earth to go about making sure that the discourse is logical? Let's take a look at that after our break. So let's take stock of where we're at so far. We are talked about why we need philosophy, in what it begins, what it is, how it begins. So we've gotten all the way up to logical discourse, starting with the first principles of reason, common sense observation, logical discourse. So we see what discourse is, but how about this logic part of the picture? How do we go about ensuring that we are actually proceeding with logic? That's maybe a trickier question. So let's take a look at another example to try and get some insights into that. You don't need this down, but I'm going to write this on the board and let me know what you think. Three dots there. 4. What do we think about that?
Outrageous, but it's not wrong in that aspect.
So it seems outrageous. Yeah, I thank you. I promise I am not a goose. Well, why exactly I'm not a goose might be harder to say. Well, hopefully it's not that hard to say, but logically maybe it's a struggle. I mean, what's going on here? Why is it, what's the problem?
There are many figures of two legs.
There are certainly, yeah, so in this particular case we can say, I could draw a Venn diagram that would visualize it pretty simply. I'm sorry, is it just impossible to read the board with those blinds open? I can't. I'm at more of an angle, so I can't tell. You don't need this down anyway. Once I put the next stuff on the board, just let me know if it's hard to read from where you're at. this is a problem because the premises are both true. All geese have 2 legs, true. I have 2 legs, true. Why am I not therefore a goose? Well, as Vic said, there's many creatures that have 2 legs, and that does certainly illustrate why this particular argument is invalid, but this is just one of many possible what? This is an example of a what? It's the worst F word in philosophy. Fallacy. This is a fallacy. A fallacy exists when the premises are true, but the conclusion is false. Now, the falsity of a conclusion can arise in 2 ways. It can arise from valid logic, but a false premise. But that's, of course, not what we have here, because both of our premises are true. So if the conclusion is false, and I assure you it is, then we are left concluding that there must be a fault in the logic. In other words, it must be a fallacy. And that's well and good, because this is an easy fallacy to spot, but not all fallacies are this easy to spot. So what do we do? How do we go about ensuring that we do not succumb to fallacy? This is actually incredibly important for obvious reasons, and yet it's almost never discussed how exactly to avoid fallacy, because a certain something has been all but abandoned today. And that something is called Aristotelian logic. It has other names, but it all derives from Aristotle chronologically. Almost all we do today is symbolic logic. And I do like symbolic logic, it's great. It's very useful if you want to go into computer programming or anything like that. But it's not as useful for life. Symbolic logic. Has anyone seen all the P's and the Q's and the nots and the thens and the big long tables? And has anyone done this in high school or maybe other college classes, the symbolic logic? Okay, well, you're very lucky if you haven't. It's good and useful, don't get me wrong, but we don't think in terms of P's and Q's and knots and symbols and big truth tables, and we think in terms, what do you use to think? What are these? Words and sentences, statements. We need to have the tools to know when combinations of sentences yield conclusions that are true and when they don't. This is one example of a combination of sentences that yields a conclusion that is not true. But this is a very easy to spot example. Not all fallacies are this easy to spot. So, thankfully there's this guy named Aristotle who a couple thousand years ago figured out a structure for ascertaining with certainty the validity or the fallacious nature of every possible argument. That might sound bold, but let me explain to you really briefly. And you don't need this down. I hope that later in the semester we'll have a chance to look into this in a little more detail. But for now, I just want to give you a little sneak peek into how philosophical logic operates. All right. The fundamental building blocks of language, of sentences with which we assert propositions and that are either true or false, is of course a word. But words, the most basic combination of words would be a statement of a simple subject and a predicate. That what you're talking about, the subject, and what you're saying about it, the predicate. So, 2 simple parts to the most simple possible statement. A is B. Subject, predicate. Aristotle realized, look, there's actually 4 logically distinct ways of making a statement. Don't worry if this is a whirlwind, I'm not going to test you on this, unless I give you the notes later in the course. Universal affirmative, universal negative, particular affirmative, and particular negative. All A is B, no A is B, some A is B, some A is not B. Those are the 4 different possible statements you can make. But the most simple of all arguments is called a syllogism. A syllogism, I just put an example of one on the board. Premise 1, premise 2, conclusion. Major premise, minor premise, conclusion. This, that, therefore this. We use this all. This is how we make logical arguments. This is how debates work. This is how conversations work. This is how you think when you're seeking after truth, you think in terms of sentences that build on one another. Logically, hopefully. But here's the thing, those syllogisms that are comprised of 3 statements, well, if each statement can be made in one of 4 ways, then, and there's 3 of those statements, then how many possible syllogisms are there? Close? And this is actually tricky because, and I can't go into detail on this now, but Aristotle also discovered that there's a debate as to whether it's 3 or 4, but let's say for now that there's 4 ways you can actually arrange the primary logical components of these statements. So there's an extra combination of 4 called figures that we have to consider. Well, little math SAT crash course here, whenever you have a certain number of choices and a certain number of options for each choice, all you ever have to do to figure out the total number of things that can happen, the quintessential SAT question, you go to a restaurant, there's 3 salad options and 4 dinner options and 5 dessert options. How many different ways can you eat at that restaurant? 3 times 4 times 5. So backing up here and analyzing all logic, there are 4 times 4 times 4 times 4. There are 256 possible arguments. Every argument that ever has been made or ever will be made can be broken down into one of these 256 types. Aristotle went through every single one of them to determine what about each. Whether it is what or what. Valid or fallacious. And guess what he discovered? I sure hope I remember this correctly. Of the 256 possible arguments, that is, syllogisms, 15 of them are valid. 241 of them are therefore fallacies. So, all geese have 2 legs. Mr. O'Connor has 2 legs, therefore Mr. O'Connor's a goose is just one of the what? It's just one of the 241 possible fallacies. Now it's one of infinite fallacies, but it's one of 241 types of fallacies. I believe it is the fallacy of the undistributed middle.
You went through and listed every single one.
Yeah, and I have a table of them all, but I don't think I have it with, I don't have that folder today. I'll bring the table, because I'm sure you all really want to see that table of all 256 arguments. But it's great. I mean, this is almost a lost art, actually. There are very few people who know this anymore, what I'm telling you right now. I mean, professional career philosophers of logic don't even know how to use this. And I'm not saying I'm an expert on it. I'm not. I have a lot of brushing up to do. But if you master this, you can confidently say that you will be able to ascertain with certainty whether any argument that ever has been made or ever will be made is valid or fallacious. It's incredibly powerful. Now, I'm not saying that's absolutely necessary. Thankfully, we have an incredibly good use of our logical intuition, and we can generally smell fallacies. Like most of you could, I'm sure all of you could tell, first of all, because you know I'm not a goose, so you know something went wrong with that argument on the board. But also, you could probably just look at it and figure out, that there's not sufficient overlap here. You can see that doesn't cover enough possibilities because there's other 2-legged creatures other than geese, so on and so forth. But we can't necessarily be sure that we'll spot every fallacy that quickly, because we won't. A lot of them hide much better than the goose one right there did. And when you start studying the fallacies, you'll see just how often people succumb to them. Now, in geometry, they sometimes cover logic a little bit, and that's helpful. And we tend to cover a few fallacies in geometry classes, like, I don't know if they even do this anymore, but they used to have a logic unit in all geometry courses in high school. Did people's geometry courses have that? Does anyone recall? There's a logic component in yours. And there's the converse fallacy, and usually we simplify logic and geometry to, if you have if A, then B, what can you not conclude from that? Yeah, you can't say if B then A. That's not valid. It might be by chance in a given case, but it's not necessary. When we're talking about logical validity, we're talking about something necessarily being valid. You can't conclude if B then A, and you can't conclude if not A then not B. But you can conclude the contrapositive, which is
If not A, then
close?
not B, then
If not B then not A, yeah. So if it's raining, the sidewalk is wet. You can't say from that given, if the sidewalk is wet, then it's raining, because the sidewalk could be wet for some other reason. You can conclude that if the sidewalk is not wet, then it's not raining. And that's good. That's very useful. I'm glad that we go over that in geometry. But that's only 2 fallacies covered in one valid argument, and there's a lot more into logic than that. And it's really helpful to at least have a basic understanding of Aristotle's approach to logic. You'll be able to analyze, again, as I said, every argument, every single one. Now, you won't be able to use Aristotelian logic to determine whether premises are true or false. You have to investigate each premise to make sure it's true. And only once you know whether the premises are true can you thereby conclude from a valid argument that the conclusion is necessarily true. But we need both. We need to make sure our premises are true, and we need to make sure our logic is valid. If you have done that, if you are sure that your 2 premises are true, and that your conclusion validly, logically follows from it, what do you have? What do you know? You know, it's a fact. The conclusion is a fact. Philosophy and math are the only 2 subject areas in school where you will never be asked to take anything on faith. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with taking things on faith. There's not. We have to, practically speaking. You can't build chemistry or physics or biology up from the ground. You can't do it. There's too much. The only practical way to go about being a biologist, which I hope many people continue to do, is to take what for granted? Yeah, hopefully facts, certainly. But just basically the consensus of the biologists before you, right? Like basically the givens of the textbook that you were trained with. I mean, don't be dogmatic about it, obviously. But just pragmatically speaking, there's no other way to do it. You can't build in your own mind biology from the ground up. That's what we must do, though, with math, although they're unfortunately getting away from that in math. They're getting so impatient, wanting to get every high school student through calculus, that we start forgetting the fundamentals and we no longer build math from the basics up. Unfortunately, we're abandoning that today. But we still have a sense of duty in that regard, and it is indeed a duty to build that from the ground up. They still do it in geometry fairly well. But philosophy must be like that. And if we've approached philosophy like that, if we've built it from the first principles of reason and common sense, step by step, using valid logical discourse, if you've gone about philosophy like that and built it step by step in your own mind, and you know that you've come to a conclusion validly using that process, you own that conclusion for the rest of your life. That is your possession. No one can take that away from you. Because even if there comes a time where you can't remember all the steps that you used to get there, you can remember what? You can remember that you got there. And that's how it works. I fully admit, that's how it works with, that's how it is with me in many cases with math that I've taught. I am absolutely certain of the Pythagorean theorem. I do not hesitate to say that. But I can't remember why. I just remember that I, in the past, have gone through every single step of that proof, and I knew each step with certainty, and I knew the starting points with certainty, and I knew that I used valid logic to get there. Therefore, I know that the conclusion is true, and no one can ever take that conclusion from me because it's my own intellectual possession. I own it. I'm not taking it from anybody else by owning it, though. That's the great thing about intellectual possessions. You don't have to take them from other people. But if we philosophize well, again, you have added a weapon to your arsenal that you'll always have. It is infinite value. It is of infinite value to come to certain conclusions about the most important questions that life has to offer. So that's what I hope we can try to do over the next several weeks.